Hey, I'm Sid. You are in my office, so this is kind of strange. But this is the new way. So let's see what we get here. As I said, I'm Sid. To tell you this story, we need to go back in 2017. So in 2017, me and a friend, Fernando, we started the design system team at Auth0. And what that looked like was we built a bunch of design tokens, design assets, component libraries, a bunch of things. And this served about 400 employees at Auth0. So it's not your tiny company, but it's also not, one of the big, massive ones. And we did this with like a team of three-ish people. Right? It was three to begin with. So what's interesting is to understand what a design system at Auth0 meant, you need to understand what the org chart looked like. So the design system team sat deep inside the design org, which meant, we put sticky notes on the wall and sometimes we wore hats. And, I'm a developer and I was working in this team of designers. And then, I had a lot of fun, learned a lot. But what did a design system mean to us? You need to kind of go back to the definitions. And I really like this one specific definition by Kari Saarinen. He said design systems are a set of multidisciplinary, shared, integrated principles and patterns that define the overall design of the product. Let's break that down. So what is a design system? It's a set of principles and patterns. So when you say principles, it means rules and guidelines, things like color, what is the voice of your brand, even small things like spacing strategy can come into principles. And then patterns are your repeatable and reusable blocks, right? So this could be a Figma file, this could be a CSS library, this could be a React component library. All of those are patterns that can be repeated. And what makes these things part of a design system is they have to be shared and integrated. So that means it's shared not just between developers, but designers, developers, product managers, copywriting, marketing folks, basically everyone in the company. And it needs to be integrated into the process. So, tools people use every day. So if your company uses Framer or Sketch or Figma or whatever for design, it should be there. And the same principles also go into the components or CSS based on how you write UI. And the goal, of course, of all of this is to define the overall design of the product. But a lot of times it's also to improve it, right? By the process of systematizing, you're aiming to improve the overall design of the product. So, um, so basically what I'm saying is we were some developers and designers sitting deep inside the design org and shipping all kinds of things. So me, I was spending a lot of time on our React components, and this is one of my favorite ones. So we built a page header, and when you use this page header, it has a very mechanical React UI, React API. So you say, JSX, you say page header, and you say this is the title, this is the description, and then you could pass it two components or two buttons in these props. What's interesting about this is when you're on the application developer side, somebody using this, you're not really thinking much about how this is going to look like. What you're really thinking about with the API is what is this called? What are the actions that the user should be able to take? And all of the design decisions were kind of baked into the component. So for example, is the clients on the top left, is it an H1 tag? Is it an H2 tag? What's the font size? And which button comes first? Does the primary come first or the secondary comes first? What's the gap in between? When you start tabbing through these things, does it read the description first or does it read the actions first, right? So it's not just aesthetic, it's also about the accessibility, and it's also about, all of these tiny details. And what's interesting about this is we were able to spend a lot of time on this. And it brings me to this article by Brad Frost, where he mentioned something called the front of the front end. And his article basically laid out that the front end ecosystem is so big that you can have people who focus on the front of the front end and the back of the front end as different groups of people, and they come together and build something. And I spent a lot of time on the front of the front end, and it kind of freed me up into focusing on really small details like accessibility, getting it just right, what should be the order in which the screen reader reads it, uh, are our components responsive, like is that page header responsive, like each tiny detail we were able to get right. But we were only able to do that because we only focused on that. And I did not focus any of my time on what did the state management look like, or how do you fetch data for this page. All of that was offloaded to the back of the front end developers. Uh, Fast forward to 2019, beautiful times before this year started. I moved to this smaller company called Sandbox, which has 11 employees, right? So going from like 400 employees to 11 employees. And I noticed a few things, which is we still had the same problems. Like we still had the same problems of inconsistency. They were design that didn't really match all the things. If you go to different pages, you can see that different developers built this. And the product lacked an overall, like a sense of brand. And these were exactly the problems that we were solving with design systems. So I'm kind of aware of this, like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I was initially worried, but it's like at an 11 member team, I can't really justify having a design system team, let alone spend all of my time working on reusable things. And so then I kind of switched my thinking around what if design systems don't have to be a team or a set of, like an isolated resource, dedicated resource. What if you look at design systems as a set of tools that can be shared by the team and is integrated in the process? It has all the same qualities because we want all the same rewards, but a different model of it. And I really like this analogy of like hammer and nails. And I was like, what is this tool? And it's probably like more like a Swiss Army knife because it has all of those small tools. And I made a list of all the things we did at Auth0. And it's kind of a long list. And I was looking at what are things that we could really borrow that would make sense for an 11-member company. And I thought for this talk, I'll get this Swiss Army knife. It's really cool if I whip it out right now. But then I went and it's like $74. So I decided not to. But what's cool about it, it does come in dark theme. But what really got me is that Swiss Army knives comes in all shapes and sizes. They're like really tiny ones, which are also cheaper. And they just have like these two things. And I started to think about, instead of like this big arsenal of tools, what would a really small Swiss Army knife look like? And that's kind of what got us here, which is what does a tiny design system for a tiny team look like? So there are 5 things that I think are the best ones now that we're like a few years older, wiser. These are the 5 things that we picked, and this is like my suggestions for you to pick. The first one is constraint-based design. So constraint-based design basically goes on to say that you, instead of picking from a wide, infinite set of variables, you always pick from a constraint set. So you can start off with things like typography, where instead of picking by hidden trial, you say, this is our typography scale. So you see there are like a finite set of values here. And the good thing is all of our tools understand these things. So with something like Figma, you can actually create tokens for these. I don't think they call it tokens, but we're going to run with that. So you can call them tokens. And you see we've named our tokens like body 1, body 2, body 3, and they all have a pixel value attached to them. So whenever Danny, our designer, he's working on Figma, he always picks from one of these values, and he knows that if he needs to create some hierarchy, he's going to jump from, let's say, body 3 to body 4, right? And he's not trying to find like an exact pixel value. These are based on some mathematical rules. I'll have a link at the end of this slide where you can read up more about these things. You can do the same thing with colors. So these are half of our colors. And again, you can encode these in tools like Figma. Then you can do more interesting things. So for example, if you have colors, you can also make variables for yourself, right? I like to call them decision variables. These are my decision tokens. So in our text, we're mostly like a dark app. So on the dark app, we have like text body, which is very light. And then there's a text subtle, which is just gray enough to still be accessible. And there's link and destructor. So all of these still come from like our initial set of colors here. Like I think the link is blue 600, one of the blues that we have. But we encode it again, like we create another layer on top of it so that you can refer these. And in practice, what this looks like is even in Figma, when Danny, our designer, is designing things, he basically picks, like, I want a color, I want to create some hierarchy, let me make this the main one text body, and then pick body 3 size. And then if I have another one, let's make it text subtle, because this is slightly less important information. You can also play with font size, like maybe this should be body 2, but all of those options are here. But it's from a restrictive constraint set, and that's the first point. You can also take this further, where, for example, we do this for spacing. All of our space or margins and paddings are units of 4. So you see, like, you can see 8, 8, and 48. And what's funny is that Figma doesn't let you do spacing tokens as a drop down or as an option like it does for text and color. So Danny actually has, like, on the top side, you'll see that he has these boxes that he keeps around so that whenever he needs to align something, he can pull them off. I find that, like, very funny. So you can do with, you can do these things with typography, color, space. These are the 3 obvious ones and probably the most useful ones. But you can also take them further. You can do that with border radius. So these are the 3 border radiuses that we pick from. And again, Figma doesn't really support having these as tokens, but it's you can always declare your own and remember them. So what has happened in the code flow is that this conversation never happens. Like, I've never never pinged my designer and says, what's the color for the error state again? And he says, oh yeah, let me check. And he gives me a hex code. Also, funny enough, Slack actually renders hex code, which is odd to me. Like, that's how far we've gone in one direction, where our chat app understands hex codes and renders like a small box for you. So how does this all look in code? Depending on your stack. So on the left, I have the same thing in JavaScript, where I have all my tokens. I define them as like a JavaScript object. And I say, these are all my grays. You can also do the same thing with CSS variables if you're not doing it in JavaScript, and that's totally fine too. So you can make CSS variables and reference them wherever. We use it on the JavaScript side, no specific reason. We just like that more. And so this is what our colors look like. This is kind of it. They're like a bunch of grays, a few blues and reds, but then we just have one of each of like green, purple, yellow, because we don't use them a lot. And this is what our entire tokens look like. So you have a few font sizes, the ones I showed, and you have a few space. So if you look at space, you'll notice that it's like 0 corresponds to 0, 1 corresponds to 4, 2 to 8. They're all multiples of 4. And if you look at the font sizes, these are the same font sizes from the previous one. So when I say body 2, it's actually the second one over here. So its font size is 2, is 12 pixels, which is the same as body 2 in Figma. And just this symmetry, just this copying both, keeping the same at the same time, keeping the values same across apps, across tools, gives you the shared language between designers and developers. Because if there's a value, it has to be one of these. And when somebody says, let's use body 2 for this, you know exactly what it means. I showed you, like, we use it for radius as well. So these are our radius. We call them small, medium, large. The naming is really up to you. We also do it for shadows. And this whole JSON or JavaScript object structure is adopted from the system UI spec. So there's a link on the top right. And then I showed you the decision layer. This is where it becomes interesting. This is why we use JavaScript objects, but you can do the same with CSS, is every JavaScript object can have more things attached to it. So for example, here, after I've defined my tokens, I say tokens.colors text. I'm going to define another layer on top and put body subtle link destructive. So text subtle is actually gray 400 aliased, right? So we just call these decision tokens. And in the code, when you reference text.subtle, you're actually getting gray 400, but you don't have to think about which shade of gray was it. All right, so the second thing that you need is really good primitives. And I think this is like I'm at the React conference, so it's not very scandalous to say that React is really the best way to do this. Like, a component model really nails down the idea of a primitive very well. And the concept is, how do you get these tokens into components? So what you want to do is you want to get the same terminology going forward. So let's try to build something. This is how Code Sandbox looks. I'm going to focus only on like a very small part, the text on the top left. And to build this, we have a text primitive. So text is just a React component. It renders a span, but it's smarter than that. So when you just use text, this is kind of what you get. And you can see like the design on the left and the rendered version on the right don't match at all. And a lot of times what I would do is open Figma and then just inspect what's in the design. So I can see that this element, the title is actually body 3, and that's the size. And I can go to my text component and say text size 3. And the text component is just rendering a span with the font size of body 3 because we have the same values in both the places. Next up, if you look at the colors, the description is a subtler color. So when I hover on it, I see it's text subtle. And we do this by saying variant. And so you can have text size 3, variant subtle, which gives you the exact same thing. Lastly, you see there's like some gap in between two. And it's 8, it's a multiple of 4 because that's our scale. And this is where our stack component, which is basically just a glorified flexbox, we drop that in and say gap 2, which actually applies margin between the two elements that it has of exactly two units, which for us on the 4-point scale is actually 8 pixels. So looking at what's on the left and looking at what's on the right, there's a lot of common language, right? You're not rethinking how to style things. You're really applying the same, like the sizes are the same, the colors are the same. Like when you say text subtle and you say text using a variant subtle, it means the same thing. And that really speeds up the flow, but also makes us really, really consistent in how our branding works. So if the design itself is very consistent, the code is also very consistent, and we've overall seen like a high increase in quality of how our application looks over time just by having really good primitives. All right, let me show you another example if you just need like that extra push. So here is a stats component that you see on the left, this one. If you have to code this, what would that look like? So what I start with this is I actually just inspect it and see, okay, this is text subtle and body 3. So I'm going to add a text component. I'm going to forward it for you. Text 3, variant subtle. And then I add, what's inside it. And then I need to see what's the icon. The icon is also subtle. And this is the interesting part. So the icon is a heart, I know that. But how do I get the color right? And the interesting way to get it is all our icons use current color as the SVG. So it's an SVG with a fill of current color, which means if I wrap it in a text variant subtle, I get the same effect of the two text and icon match. And then of course I can wrap them in a stack to align them. And then I zoom in, I see what's the space between them. It's 4 pixels, it's 1 unit on our scale, so it's gap 1. And there we go. And then I put all of them, like there's 3 of them. I need to see what's the margin between these two. It's 16, of course, on a scale, and which means the margin between 2 of these should be 16, which is 4 units. So I wrap the whole thing in a stack, and I put gap as 4, so that all of these have the same gap. And then I just change the values, and yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how you create like a stats component here. So again, just to show like just a few primitives really kind of makes working with designers and also designing good interfaces really cool. Point number 3 on this list is having a theming system. So this is totally optional. If your application has themes, then you need it. Otherwise, you can just ignore this. Code Sandbox unfortunately needs a lot of themes. So with Code Sandbox, you can just use any of the VS Code themes that are possible, at least the one that we have here. And which means it could look like anything. It could be a light mode, dark mode, it could be a purple mode for all we know. And that really means we need to have like a really strong theming system. So, earlier when I said tokens get translated into components, that's not the full story. What happens is tokens and a VS Code theme convert into like a UI theme, which is fed to the components. So we basically run a function to get like the current VS Code theme. We twist it around to get like a UI theme, which kind of looks like this. So for example, even with a VS Code theme, VS Code doesn't have everything. So VS Code doesn't have avatars and switches that we have. And then we try to figure that out based on the current theme. So we take the current theme, we make another theme out of it. And this theme is really fed into the components. So inside a component, if an avatar uses avatar border, it doesn't really know what avatar border means, which is done in the previous one. So you could be in a dark theme, light theme, purple theme. It never really breaks because we always make sure the values are there because we insert them. Similarly, for text variants, when you say text subtle or text link, all of that is fed in this middle theming layer. So the components never really know about the theme. And I think this is like an important way of important distinction that we have made because we had to, but I think it's a very good practice in general, where your components don't really care about the theme. They always get the same tokens. And it's the theming layer that translates these tokens across themes into something that the components can use. And naming can be whatever you want. We just go for like a mixed kind of name, like avatar border. The background color is used as avatar border. We're kind of okay with that. It's not ideal, but it's good enough. Point number 4 is an icon workflow. Again, if your app uses a lot of icons, which I guess most apps do, this would be useful for you. Otherwise, that's all right. I wanted to include this because I wanted to show that our icon workflow is actually pretty crap, but it is a workflow. How we do this is every time you need an icon, you make sure it's in this one Figma file called icons. And it's in a 16 by 16 box. That's the only rule. So if it's 16 by 16, we copy, right click, copy as SVG, put it into this code file called icons.typescript, very creative. And we do the same. We make sure it's an SVG. The view box is 16 by 16. And inside that, that is the SVG with fill current color. This is important so that we can color it outside with text subtle and text link and all of that. So this basically, this entire thing is our icon flow. And I wanted to show that even if you don't have automated tools, or even if you don't have like a high-tech setup for it, a design system doesn't need to be high-tech. It just needs to be a set of shared principles and shared patterns that are integrated into our process. So this is literally our process. Like whenever we want an icon, we drop it in a Figma file. We make sure it's 16 by 16, and then we right-click copy into icons.tsx. And what this gives us while like building the application is when I have to use an icon, I can say icon name, and then I get TypeScript autocomplete, plus I can change the size here. And that size is based on like the 16. So if I say 12, I get a smaller thing than the default. And that kind of takes us a long way. Yep, Figma icon goes to icon.tsx. All right, the final thing, the fifth thing, which I took from like Big Design Co earlier, is visual testing. This is kind of a rare one. Not a lot of people do visual testing, but I think this was so important in like a big design system that I copied it in the tiny one as well. And for this, the whole thing is we use this tool called Chromatic, which takes our storybook. So it takes our stories and then snapshot test them. So by snapshot, I mean like literal photo snapshots, where it looks at the previous one and the new one. And if it has changed, then you have to click accept. So it's a lot like just snapshot testing, but with literal photo snapshots. And of course, it reports to Git so that you can approve, you can reject. If you see that something has broken, you can change it. So this happens when you're, especially when you're playing with the primitives. Like if I'm playing with the stack or the text primitives, a lot of other components use those primitives. And then when I'm breaking it, I'm breaking something down the chain for a long while. Without Chromatic, I don't think we would be able to catch it. All right, those are our 5 things. Those are the 5 things I have stolen from big design system world into small, tiny teams. I encourage you to figure out what does your small Swiss Army knife look like, what is the size of it, and then what things make sense for you to build your design system. The whole moral of my story is that just pick the things that really help you, and it's never too early to start a design system. We're at least seeing that since we introduced the primitives and the token system, our quality of product has really gone high. So I'm a fan, and I hope you're. Thanks. If you want the notes, if you want anything that I mentioned, it's on this link called sid.st/reactlive. And yeah, if you want more about this, follow me on Twitter. Thanks.